Hey, look at that.
Okay, hey, calling Chris Anderson. Where?
I'm in Edinburgh this time.
Edinburgh.
Yes,
Is that how you
at
say that?
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh. All
I
right.
was I was corrected today. So yes, Edinburgh.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm here in Chicago.
You are
I
for how
am
much longer?
well, a couple of weeks before leaving on the Ghost Army tour. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, which has a way of flinging Chris and I and various other people around the world, in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. And you can check out our trips at stephenambrostours.com. .com.
Yes,
So of course we're recording this a few days before the show airs because it's an encore show. But did you were at the tattoo last night in
yeah, it was
Edinburgh?
incredible. Yeah,
So
it was
that was
great.
good.
That was very good. Lots
Yeah.
of the sun was showing. Well, it wasn't raining, so that was great, and everybody loved it. Really cool performance, and hundreds of bagpipers playing at Edinburgh Castle. What could be better?
Wow. Who can beat that, right?
You know,
I want to remind everybody that whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast,
yes.
thank you for joining us. And we're going to be presenting an encore episode of our interview about Josephine Baker. So let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. I do not have a drink today, Chris.
No,
I'm
I just got in from touring, so I'm going to fix that problem soon. But right now I'm drinkless.
Yeah, well, that's good. But if you guys can let us know what you're drinking, or let each other know, and put that out there, that would be fantastic. And while you're doing that, I just want to say that we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, and we have a
Absolutely.
new Patreon supporter this week, Connie McKenzie. Not a new
Oh,
viewer, but a new Patreon supporter, and
super duper.
we're filling that page up. We get a couple of more top shelf supporters, and that page will be all full. And hey, you can support at any level. We have a couple of new $5 supporters as well. So if you want to join us, please do at patreon.com/historyhappyhour.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Do you think that we've killed enough time that we can now actually bring on our encore episode?
I think perhaps yes, just a bit.
All right. All right, why don't
You
you give
ready?
me a cue?
All
Yeah.
right.
I'm ready.
You brought the bell, or is that a phone bell? Oh yeah. See, it didn't ring quite the same way.
The bar's open.
Bars open.
What's on tap, Chris?
Yeah. Well, this week we've been getting a lot of interest in this show. Once the bell is
The,
off,
the bell keeps ringing.
the
It's
bell's
it's
so excited
it's,
about this week's
it's hard
show.
to control. Yes.
Yeah. Well, this week we have author Damien Lewis on to join us to talk about his new book about Josephine Baker. And for those of you who don't know, you should. Damien Lewis is an award winning writer who's spent more than 20 years writing about all kinds of nasty conflicts for the BBC and other people. And when he's not busy with that, he's a best selling author of a lot of books, as we would say in Boston, more than 20, in fact, with a special emphasis on military history. And he looks quite a bit. He's most well known over here, I think, for his series of books on the Special Air Service and War Dogs. But this week we're going to talk about his new book, which I'm really excited about: Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French Hero, and British Spy.
Damien Lewis, welcome.
Great to be with you guys.
I,
I
I, I should
appreciate it.
should ask everybody if you have a cocktail with you today. It is happy hour, of course.
It is happy hour.
What have you got, Chris?
Oh, I've got a Bailey's because it's cold, wet, gray, and miserable here.
Okay. And Damien, what did you bring to the table?
That is a brandy Alexander.
Oh,
Oh my
that is much
goodness!
more sophisticated. Yes.
And I'm here in the good old U.S. of A. drinking a beer out of a plastic cup.
Oh, so after you insulted my dress sense, you're drinking a beer out of a plastic cup.
I
Okay.
insulted your dress sense off the air now, but
Oh,
thanks for bringing that up.
so anyway, so should we talk about some history? Okay.
Yeah, please, Chris, please.
So, David, just to start, Ernest Hemingway said that she was, and she obviously is Josephine Baker, the most sensational woman anybody ever saw or ever will. And I think that probably in the years, a decade since her death, maybe she's not as well known as she once was. Could you, just to kind of give us a baseline, tell us a little bit about who she was and how big a sensation she was before the
Sure.
war?
Yeah. So Josephine obviously was, born in St. Louis in the States, and brought up in poverty, and pretty much ran away from home and from St. Louis in her early teens. And how that came about was that she a traveling kind of salesman came to St. Louis, and the way he brought people he was a quack, really. He sold medicines, dodgy medicines. And the way he got people to his stall was he had a competition. The competition was you won $1 if you were the best dancer. And as soon as he announced the competition, Josephine jumped up on stage and danced, and she won the competition. Ran home to her mother with that $1 bill. And she suddenly realized in that moment, maybe there's a way that I could actually get out of poverty and earn a living by dancing, using this talent, this natural talent that I have. And trying to cut a long story short, she realized that, she would have to make her way to Broadway in New York. And that's the place you make it as somebody on the stage. And so she did that. It was very difficult. There were lots of challenges on the way, but eventually she kind of broke through, and she starred in a show called Shuffle Along and various others. But by the age of 19, she was cognizant, very aware of the fact that in Jim Crow America, where segregation was still all the rage, of course, she was never going to make it as the star she believed or she hoped she might be. And so at that moment, 19 years of age, an American impresario who lived and worked in Paris, approached her because she was putting on starting a new show called Le Revue Negre, a new musical in Paris. And she invited Josephine to be the lead female role. And Josephine had heard that Europe was relatively free of segregation, of the kind of prejudices she'd experienced in the States. And she decided to go. I mean, it was a difficult decision. She took her heart in her hands, sailed on a liner from New York to Paris, daunting for a young girl who'd never been out of the States. But she did just that. And when she arrived in France and, she started to star in the show in Paris, she realized very quickly that this maybe was a country where she could be everything she wanted to be. It was a liberation for her and a revolution. And that show, there were two reactions to that show, really. One was people were absolutely bowled over and amazed and in rapture. And the other was people were scandalized and outraged because there was lots of nudity, and it played very much to the kind of noble savage stereotype, which was all the rage in Europe at the time, has to be said. But very quickly it catapulted Josephine into the limelight and in stardom, into superstardom. This toured Europe. She went to all the major capitals, including, of course, Berlin, where it was an absolute sellout. It was a sellout all over Europe. And by her early 20s, Josephine had become certainly one of the most photographed, if not the most photographed women in the world. And she was, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Hemingway, you mentioned, Picasso, all the top arts and social scene in France. And she was a very, very wealthy woman. She went from success to success to success. And as time went on, she kind of graduated, I guess, from the kind of risque, almost naked, sexually charged routines, much more to these kind of, she was doing opera, immediately prior to the war. She was singing in, I forgot the name of the opera, I'm sorry. So she kind of not only just found herself and the equality that she'd sought for so long in France and Europe, European cities across Europe, but she also found not only fame and fortune, but she found her mojo as a serious performer, and was acclaimed by critics as being, having this fantastic singing voice and this fantastic ability to dance. And not only that, of course, she also became a movie star. She starred in 3 movies before the war, and she was the first black female role in a major movie ever. So she broke all these glass ceilings at the same time. That's kind of Josephine in a nutshell, in the run up to her life in the run up to the war.
So I have not now, nor have I ever served in any espionage service. But if I was recruiting a spy, I probably wouldn't go with the best known person and the best known face in Europe or maybe the world at that time. I just would probably go somewhere else on the spectrum. So I'm wondering, how does it happen that she gets recruited as a sort of an amateur spy? The phrase used was honorable correspondent. How does that happen, and why her?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. That's exactly what I thought when I first, about probably 11, 12 years ago now, heard that Josephine Baker had been a spy in World War II, which is just a snippet of reportage somewhere. And I thought, well, that's impossible. Just like you, one of the most famous women in the world before the war, so instantly recognizable, such a signature, brand almost.
It sounds like hype or something,
Yeah, that's not possible. How can you be a grey person hiding in the shadows? How can you be a cloak and dagger warrior if you are the most instantly recognizable, one of the world's greatest superstars? It's just crazy.
You have to ask Chris, because he's dealt with all that.
Yeah. So that's what piqued my interest. I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. And there was resistance, a lot of resistance to the initial suggestion that Josephine be recruited as a spy. I mean, it came about because, we've got to bear in mind that the First World War and all those millions of deaths wasn't that long ago. It's still fresh in people's minds. There were still war wounded, on the streets. And so Britain and France in particular were just unwilling to countenance the fact that there might be another war with the old enemy in Europe. It just was something that we did not want to think about or believe or prepare for. And to that extent, the intelligence services in France and Britain as well were woefully underfunded and woefully understaffed in the run-up to the war. And so in their attempts to warn Allied leaders, French and British leaders in particular, that war was coming, that Nazi Germany was going to go to war, and Hitler knew exactly what he was doing, all their warnings were falling upon deaf ears. And at the same time, they were getting inundated with German spies from the Abwehr, the German Foreign Intelligence Service. France and Britain as well were just getting swamped. And so these underfunded intelligence services, and the British and French intelligence service, were working very, very closely prior to the war, especially in Paris. Commander Dunderdale, we'll probably mention him later, and Paul Pelol, thick as thieves, trying to work out how they could counter this threat. And so they came up with this idea, well, we've got no budget to hire agents, got no political support. So they fell back upon a tried and tested means of asking for volunteers. It's as simple as that. And in France, they called them honorary correspondents. And basically, an honorary correspondent is a freelance, voluntary spy who, because of the nature of their family or their work or their upbringing or their profession, walks in those kind of circles and fields where it's conducive to be a good spy. So, for example, of course, journalists and authors make good spies because we're always traveling, asking difficult questions, taking notes is a great cover for being a spy. But so too, actually, as it happens, do performers, because similar set of reasons. They travel all over the world. They've got every reason to go wherever a show is being held, and they mix with those high society circles. So there was this kind of tradition that performers could make good honorary correspondents and indeed spies. But when Josephine was suggested, and the suggestion was made in the at the Deuxième Bureau, which was the French counterintelligence service, those people who were charged to hunt down all the German spies across France, among other things. And the suggestion was made by Colonel Paul Pelol, who was the head of the German desk at the Deuxième Bureau. And it did not meet with universal enthusiasm, and for several reasons. One, there was the history of Mata Hari, which you'll all know of, the First World War spy. He was likewise a dancer who, of course, turned out to be a double agent. So there was that shadow hanging over them. But also, people questioned whether someone like Josephine would be one of those, and I paraphrase, one of those, high-flying stars who would shatter like glass at the first sign of danger. So they wondered if she had the steely resolve to be a spy. And it was only because Colonel Paylol, insisted that Captain Jacques Abte, who was one of his deputies, long-standing Deuxième Bureau agent, was obliged to go and try to recruit Josephine. And he did so with very low expectations. In fact, he almost had to be forced to drive out to her chateau where she lived on the outskirts of Paris in Le Vessinet to make the approach. And he expected to come back empty-handed. He expected to meet the archetype of Josephine, and that's you can imagine her, wonderful ball gown, dripping in jewelry, very much the high society, high flying, figure that had been manufactured to front up her brand, and that really wasn't something he thought that they could adopt to the ends of the Deuxième Bureau and being an honorary correspondent.
So David, I think it's also important maybe to talk about what France means to Josephine and how she views her position in France, because again, early 20s, international sensation, entertainer. She could have said, "Hey, I'll entertain the troops," and then, when the war starts, catch a boat to somewhere else. But that's not what she does. And you have a really moving quote. She says when she's approached by Abte, it says, and asks her to get involved in this. She says, "France has made me all that I am. I shall be eternally grateful to her. I gave my heart to Paris as Paris gave me hers. Captain, I am ready to give my country my life. Dispose of me as you will." I mean, this was a very serious commitment on her part.
Yeah, sure. And you're absolutely right, of course. Josephine, she'd actually given up her American citizenship because she married a Jewish guy called Jean Lyon just before the war, Jewish industrialist. They'd fallen in love. In fact, he taught her to fly. So she was a pilot, amongst many other things. She flew her own light aircraft. I mean,
in her spare time.
In her spare time. And that became part of her spying work as well. But despite the fact she'd given up her American citizenship, which you had to at that time to become French, she could have gone to the American embassy and got her papers and gone back to the States, no problem at all. When it became clear that Nazi Germany was on the march, and along with all those other Americans who did, it wasn't their fight. They were neutral in the war. She was this global superstar. Why not? Well, the why not is a really important question to answer. It's a standout quality of Josephine. So to illustrate it, really, just jump back 2 or 3 years. I said she performed in the Le Revue Negre in Berlin and toured Germany, and she had this, standout, sellout success. Well, she returned 1937, 36, 37, on a tour which was scheduled to last for 6 months. She lasted 3 weeks. And she lasted 3 weeks because she came face to face with the horrors of the rise of Nazism herself, on the stage, in terms of the heckling, in terms of leaving the theatres getting attacked, in terms of the horrendous vitriolic abuse in the press, and also the official attacks made upon her by the German authorities, by the authorities of Nazi Germany. And so within 3 weeks, she'd seen the ugly, horrific, xenophobic, you name it, face of Nazism. And she realized what was coming. She realized herself at first hand what was coming. And, she came back from that. And then shortly thereafter, of course, there was the International Exposition in Paris, and Goebbels, the Nazi Germany's propaganda minister, published a pamphlet of all the things that were degenerate that Nazi Germany stood against, and Josephine was on the cover. So Nazi Germany itself had made her, an enemy of the state. And bear in mind what Josephine had found in France and Europe. In France and Europe, she'd found the freedom to be who she could be. And she'd taken that to heart. She'd been given wings and she could fly. And suddenly, this is the point, she saw in the rise of Nazi Germany, the rise of this horrendous credo which could take all of that away from her again. And the point was, Nazi Germany was about a global Reich. That they weren't going to stop at the borders of Europe. This was a world project. And so if the world fell under the shadow of Nazism, where could Josephine Baker and those like her flee to, where they could be safe from those predations? Well, there was nowhere. So you could argue she had no option but to stand and fight, and that's what she argued herself.
So the book goes into a lot of detail about everything she did over a period of time from 1938 in terms of espionage to something early 1944, as well as kind of a little bit beyond that. But maybe you could give us an idea, a little bit of a sense of what kind of espionage she is carrying out. You can give us an example or a couple of examples. What is she doing and how is she doing it? Because she's pretty inventive and pretty amazing in the way that she is transmitting or carrying information. But give us a little bit of a sense of Josephine Baker, the spy.
Yeah, so the first ever mission she was given, so Jacques Abte goes to recruit her, and he's gobsmacked. He's bowled over because he turns up at the chateau, and she far from being, glittering ball gown and jewels, she's dressed in a gardening clothes, gathering snails to feed her ducks. She was a lifelong lover of animals, and so very quickly they're sat together in her chateau, and he's treated to something which people who worked with Josephine and knew her, termed the Josephine effect, which was this absolutely magnetic, unique ability that she had to reach out from people on the stage. So if you were in the audience, she had this way of making you believe she was there singing, especially individually for you personally, and dancing for you personally. It was quite exceptional. And one of her dancers who's still alive, a guy called Jean-Pierre Reguilori, lives in New York, French guy, who was hugely helpful in my research. He was the first person who described this to me, and he said it was just so powerful. Jacques Abte's treated to that, and he thinks, well, if we can harness the Josephine effect, which she uses so well on the stage, to the world of espionage, there is nothing, arguably, which this person is not going to be capable of in terms of espionage. And so he sets her a challenge, and he says, look, your first mission, the Allies are desperate to know what the intentions of the Italians will be, the Italian government, Mussolini will be, should Nazi Germany declare war. Because at that time, we didn't know, some months before the outbreak of war, the declaration of war by Germany. And so the reason Abte gives her that assignment in particular is because she wasn't always the best judge of character. And before the war, she had become enamored by Mussolini. She'd been on tour to Italy and fallen for his kind of strongman persona, and she'd realized afterwards, of course, that how mistaken she had been. But as far as the Italians were concerned, she was still flavor of the month, and that gave her a fantastic in with the Italians, and in particular with the Italian embassy in France. And so she went to the Italian embassy on Jacques Abte's first mission, and she seduced, possibly physically, certainly psychologically, the defense attaché at the Italian embassy. And the first Jacques Abte knew that she had something to tell him was when he got a phone call from her saying, we must meet, sounding very, very excited. And they met in her Delage luxury motor car, upholstered in snakeskin in central Paris. And she drove him through the streets. And he was far more scared of her driving than he was of the snakeskin, because she was so excited that she was driving very erratically, to such an extent they got arrested by a Paris traffic cop. And it was only when he pulled them over, expecting a drunk driver, and found it was Josephine, and she treated him to that trademark smile, that he let her off, and they continued on their journey. She told Jacques Abte exactly what she'd found, which was, of course, she found out that not only was Mussolini going to join forces with Nazi Germany, but that deal had already been done. It had been inked. They already had a contract in place to combine forces as the Axis. So that was an incredible achievement. But at the same time, Abte was thinking, spycraft is a subtle, many-faceted thing, and it takes an awful long time to learn. There's a lot to learn. Will I be able to control and hone and shape this new special agent in the way that I need to, because she is so flighty and so excitable and so self-possessed? And that was his great concern. So to then move on a little more than a year, possibly 18 months. And this is the great thing about Josephine's story. Let's say 18 months from that moment, Josephine has become the spy master. She's turned the tables on him. She has become the teacher. He's become the pupil almost. And it comes about partly because she is so naturally suited to this role, but also it comes about simply because Jacques Abte can't travel anywhere. He is not a globally, recognized and acclaimed performer. Josephine still has a reason to go to Lisbon to perform in a neutral territory, or Madrid to perform in a neutral territory, even back into Vichy, France, because she is that entertainer, and she puts on these bona fide shows, and they take her to these places with her voluminous tour luggage, and every time she can go there under that cover to carry out her espionage work. Jacques Abte can't travel. He is actually at that stage for many months marooned in their base, which by that time was in Casablanca in Morocco. And so she takes over the role that he initially was worried about teaching her. And it's an exceptional thing about her wartime story, is that not only does she kind of like take hold of this craft with both hands and hone it and make it her own, but many times in the war, all those who she's serving alongside, most of whom are men, most of whom are either French, British, or American, as she increasingly serves as a spy for the British and the Americans. But at some time, nearly all of them kind of lose heart. And you can understand why, because, up until, I don't know, mid-43, you could argue that the war was going better for the Axis powers than it was for the Allies. And many people, there were many dark hours when these colleagues of her, these long-standing agents, thought the war was lost or feared the war was lost. Josephine never did, or at least she never publicly admitted it. And whenever those colleagues of hers said, I'm losing heart or something of that nature, Josephine was the one to shore them up. And she would always say, actually, this was her line: don't fear, there's nothing to worry about. And I'm paraphrasing, because America will answer the war, and will enter the war, and you don't know what Americans are capable of. You've never seen Americans in action. And when America enters the war, we will win.
So I just, you touched on this briefly, but again, just because it's just so amazing to me, she's got no training, right? She just becomes an agent. There's no, take this young woman, teach her this craft. She just dives right in.
Absolutely. I mean, the most telling example of that, and probably the most, it's not the most, it's not the most dangerous. It's hard to say which is the most. She risked her life so many. And sorry, incidentally, she didn't just risk her life. I mean, this is a really important point. Just prior to the outbreak of the war, or it could have been during the phony war, I can't quite remember, but it doesn't matter. 2 German high society ladies were caught spying for Poland in Germany. They were beheaded. Yeah. And the Gestapo had decided that, in their wisdom, you wouldn't behead people with a guillotine the way you used the tradition you do, which is with them facing downwards. You would face upwards and see the guillotine coming down, or the axe coming down. So if Josephine had been captured and unmasked, she would not just have faced death. She would have faced awful, awful, awful things in an effort to make her talk and reveal her network, amongst many other things. And so that the mission that I guess stands out in my mind, because it was of such war-changing consequence, was that first major mission that they undertake in the summer of 1940. So, and it's fascinating that, just days after Dunkirk and defeat in Europe, Churchill gathers his spy chiefs and he says to them, look, where is France? France has gone dark. We have not a single agent or source or radio station left operating. We can't defend this island, and we certainly can't go on going on the counterattack without intelligence from France. Get me back into France. And so so Paris has fallen, and Josephine's travelled to her country retreat, which is a Chateau Damien Lewis in the Dordogne, and she's there with this kind of like makeshift resistance crew. But no one knows how to resist. No one knows what to do. And then Jacques Abte turns up, and he has her mission handed down to him from Paul Pellol, the head of the Deuxième Bureau, which of course no longer exists because France has signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. So all the spying that's now going on by those right-minded Frenchmen is secret spying. It's secret spying. It's not just spying secret by its very nature. This is secret spying because you're spying illegally against the the power that your government signed an armistice with. So all of that intelligence that Abtei, Pelol, and all their colleagues secretly gathered over the summer of 1940, crucial to Britain, the only dog in the fight at that time, absolutely crucial. I mean, we're talking all the Luftwaffe air bases from where they're flying the Battle of Britain missions. We're talking the list of the German agents dropped into Britain. We're talking plans to invade Britain by the back door via Ireland and via Wales and Scotland. Plans to take Gibraltar, just reams and reams of intelligence. All of that material Abtei brings to Josephine's chateau in the Dordogne and says, we have to get this to Lisbon, because in Lisbon, the capital of neutral Portugal, at the British Embassy, there is a secret intelligence service cell, and we will get it into their hands, and from there they can spirit it to London. There are regular flights from Lisbon to London. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to hide it all in your tour luggage, and you are going to organise a tour to Lisbon. You're going to put on shows. It's going to be a bona fide tour. That's our cover. And in your tour luggage, we will hide all this intelligence. And I use the word hide advisedly, because some of it would be transcribed in invisible ink on her score sheets, her musical score sheets. And Abtei was a master at that spycraft. But some of it, so the photographs, for example, of the landing craft that the Germans were planning to use to invade Britain, other raw intelligence had to be carried as raw intelligence. So the point being, if they opened Josephine's tour trunks on that journey from France, from the Dordogne to Lisbon, and there were many checkpoints on the way, she would be finished. And Josephine embraces that mission with open arms. And indeed, over and above that, she says to Jacques Abtei, who now is, his false name is that he's Jacques Herbet, a former ballet dancing instructor from Marseille. She says to him, your name, Jacques Herbet, will be stamped in my passport with accompanying Josephine Baker as her tour manager. So you have extra cover, which would have meant, had Abtei been arrested, because of course he was far more known to the Germans, then Josephine would have been as well. So she triples the risk to herself. And they set off by train, so they go from France through the Pyrenees across the Spanish border, and that's their first major border crossing. There's Spanish customs agents, French customs agents, there are Gestapo agents, there are SS breezing along the platform. And the amazing point about it is, because I was wondering, well, how on earth did you get through? The most amazing point about it is that Josephine, I described her in her gardening clothes at a chateau. She gets off that train at that checkpoint from France into Spain, dripping in furs and jewelry, looking $1 million. And everybody who sees her goes, my God, it's Josephine Baker. And so all those agents who should have searched her and stopped and asked her for papers and searched her luggage, instead they run and fetch their wives and their girlfriends and their children to get a photograph with Josephine Baker, the super spy. And she breezes along the platform. No one searches her luggage, no one searches herself, her person. Jacques Abtei is the grey figure who's forgotten kind of in the glow of her presence. And they do that at every single checkpoint along the way, or rather she does that. And it's remarkable. To the extent they get to the airport in Madrid, and there are all these aircraft lined up on the runway, which are German warplanes with swastikas on them, because as we know, the Spanish neutrality was rather skin deep. And she does it there at the airport. They get on the plane, they fly into Lisbon, and they get those 40 files of intelligence in Josephine's tour trunks to the British Embassy. They deliver them to the Secret Intelligence Service. They're flown by BOAC scheduled flight to London. They're delivered to Wilfred Dunderdale, the former Paris spy master, Biffy Dunderdale, this incredible character, the role model for James Bond. They're delivered into his hand. 3 days later, he sends a telegram back to the embassy in Lisbon saying, London is delighted by what you have sent us. And then there's this sting in the tail, because they both were determined, Jacques Abtei and Josephine Baker were determined to then take a BOAC flight to London themselves to meet with General de Gaulle, the Free French leader who was in London, of course, whose call to arms had really helped give them the spirit to resist and find the way. And Dunderdale says, don't come. We need you back in France. We need you back in France, one, because this intelligence is gold dust, and we need much more of the same. But almost as importantly, we need you to kind of firm up concrete that pipeline, that flow. If you can go back into France and get that pipeline really flowing through Lisbon the way you've done it the first time around, we've cracked it, and that will be, the key contribution to winning the war. So that
which he does, right? I mean,
so there's two of them there. There's Jacques Capet, Josephine Baker. Dunderdale's basically ordered them. Not that he has kind of, is he there? He's their spy master. They're not working for him formally, but they're volunteers. So, and in fact, they believe they're working for de Gaulle's Free French Intelligence Services. That's a long story I can go into if you want, but Dunderdale kind of tricks them largely because they're actually working for the Secret Intelligence Service. But yeah, so
Perfidious Albion.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That's why we left.
But you got to. So Josephine and Jacques Capet are in Lisbon, and they're waiting for more detailed orders from Dunderdale. Well, they think it's from de Gaulle, but it's really from Dunderdale. And Jacques Capet says, one of us has to go. So Josephine volunteers. So she gets back on it. And this is what I was driving at when I was saying incrementally, bit by bit, step by step, she becomes the spy master. She leaves Abte in Lisbon to receive the orders and the money from Secret Intelligence Service to fund their activities. She gets on a flight, flies back into France, gets on a train, goes to Marseille, links up with Colonel Paul Pelol, who's now running this secret intelligence network across France, and tells him we've delivered the goods and this is the pipeline and we have to get it flowing. So yeah, she does exactly that.
So I want to remind everybody that we're chatting today with Damien Lewis, a terrific historian, and his book that we're talking about, it's one of many books, is Agent Josephine, and talking about the espionage carried out by Josephine Baker before and during World War II. And we have a question from the audience, so I'd like to bring that in, if that's okay. And this is from Frank Cook, who said, did the Nazis ever suspect that Josephine was a spy? Or essentially, did she get away with hiding in plain sight? Was there ever a moment when they were closing in on her or closing in on Abte, and which also could have led to problems for her?
There were many. So the first was in summer 1940. So she's at her chateau in the Dordogne, and she is gathering not only weaponry, but intelligence documents. And also she's got various former French military officers and former intelligence guys there. And actually, the moment this happened, she's got two Deuxième Bureau agents who are now the secret French intelligence service, who've come to a chateau with a load of fresh intelligence documents from Colonel Paul Pelol in Marseille. And they're in the library. She's meeting with them. And her maid comes in a panic and says, the enemy are here, basically. And what happened was a squadron of troops from the Armistice Commission, which was the body set up by Nazi Germany to police the armistice, were not just at the gates of the chateau, but had surrounded it. And the colonel comes marching into her library. She's told everyone but her to flee and hide. And he's extremely arrogant, as you can imagine, and says, we know you're hiding weapons here. We're going to search the chateau. There's been a denouncement. So someone in the community had reported her. And she basically says to him, words to the effect, I paraphrase, how dare you? How dare you believe the denouncer and put credit in what they're saying above me? And she's icy. She won't even give him the honor of addressing him either as colonel or by his name. She addresses him in the third person. She's icy and arrogant back, far more so than he can ever be. And he's thrown. He thinks, well, if she's hiding weapons and doing all the things that allegedly she's doing, how could she be behaving like this? And she says, because Josephine also had Native American Indian ancestry, and she says, the only connection I have to the war, and I'm paraphrasing, is I know how to do the Cherokee war dance relating to her ancestors, but that's it. And eventually the colonel says, he's just absolutely nonplussed. And eventually he says, well, can I at least have a cup of coffee? And she says, I would give you a cup of coffee were there any coffee left in France. But there is none, because the country's collapsed since you illegally invaded. if you go home to Germany and come again in peace as my guest, I will gladly serve you a cup of coffee, but not before then. She's just in his face. And eventually he leaves without searching the chateau at all. And shortly thereafter, she undertakes a mission, the one I've described, taking all the intelligence to Lisbon, and gets away. And that's just one example. There are many, many examples where they know and they're after her, and she's one step ahead of them.
So, Dave, no, she's like, as you explained so well in the book, she's there really from the beginning, right? She's involved in this from the days of the Phony War and then the German invasion and kind of the dark days for France. But once kind of the tide starts to turn, she kind of sticks with it. She's still involved in these sorts of things. Maybe just touch briefly about how she stays involved and what sorts of things she does from an espionage point of view after the British and the Americans, they land in North Africa and things you're looking up, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, so Josephine and Jacques Hepte played this incredible role during the preparation for the torch landings. So the landings in Northwest Africa by American and British forces, springboard, of course, for the invasion of Southern Europe. They gather crucial intelligence for that operation. The beaches, the defences, all the things you need to know. They get the local leaders on side. They're past masters by now. And indeed, the American kind of spy master they had at that stage in Morocco, because they were now reporting to the Free French, to the British Secret Intelligence Service, and of course the Americans in Washington.
No possibility of confusion there.
None whatsoever, no. And in fact, actually, it's really extraordinary. Going back to what I was talking, Perfidious Albion earlier, right? Yeah. When the torch landings are successful, de Gaulle relocates, of course, his headquarters from London to North Africa. Okay, then they discover there is this Jacques Hepte working with Josephine Baker, running some kind of espionage network. They know nothing about it. Zero. So they investigate. Hepte's basically arrested. I mean, they are seriously suspicious about what on earth has been going on. And of course, Hepte, they don't go after Josephine because she's too high profile, but they go for Hepte big time. And of course, he's saying, "Look, you knew about this all along. In the summer of 1940, we volunteered. We were in Lisbon. And of course, they know nothing because that's what Dunderdale's done. He's played a double game. He had his reasons. He definitely had his reasons. It is quite complicated. And they were walking this knife edge, and they weren't just walking that knife edge because the French didn't know what they were doing, for example. They were walking that knife edge because, and we touched upon this before the show opened in just chatting. What I love about their story, Jacques and Josephine's story, is that they would do whatever it took to defeat the Nazis, to defeat the greatest evil you could argue we faced in many centuries. They would use anything to do so. And so they worked closely with forgers, assassins, spies from other nations, but also with the mafia, with the New York mafia, and then the New York mafia as it manifested itself in North Africa and across the Mediterranean. So they were working with lots of individuals and organizations who, in a time of peace, you would have never for one moment imagined getting into a partnership with. All of that is fine in a time of war, you can argue. And of course, they were doing so very often with no blessing from those on high. So as soon as the war's over, of course, that becomes highly questionable. So they were really making it up as they went along. And once the torch landings are successful, and the American forces are there in North Africa, preparing, of course, then to push eastwards across North Africa, that pincer movement with the First Army and the Eighth Army, Rommel's defeated, then the move into Southern Europe. As they're preparing for that, they realise that, morale of the troops is very important. And Josephine Baker is this gold mine in terms of morale because, she can perform to the French troops, she can perform to the American troops, she can perform to the British troops because she speaks things in English, of course. She can perform to just about anyone, and anyone can relate to her. And so the American generals go to Josephine. She does one show in Casablanca, a benefit, and they're so blown away by it. They go to her and they say, "Look, and they got a contract to retain her services exclusively for the American forces as an entertainer for the rest of the war. And she refuses to sign it. It's a highly lucrative contract, by the way. And she refuses to sign it. And she refuses to sign it because she says, look, I will always perform for American troops. Of course I will. But I've got to be free to perform for whoever is fighting the Nazis. And if they're Polish and Czechs or German Jews or Brits or Free French, whoever they might be, I will perform for them. So I'll do it, and I'll do it, and I'm never going to get paid. She was never paid for any of her espionage work throughout the war. She insisted upon that. So she's used in that capacity as a freelance entertainer by all the Allied forces through North Africa, and then all the way through the invasion of Southern Europe, and right the way through into Germany itself. You know, in the snows of the winter of 44, 45. Under fire, under shell fire, and attacked by warplanes, and at the same time, she never really shrugs off that intelligence cloak. So in North Africa, all of that time she's there, she's gathering intelligence and feeding it back into the system to help with the Allied war effort.
Well, I want you to pick up on that, because aside from her direct espionage role, some of the descriptions of her tours for entertaining the troops, there are some pretty extreme examples of her commitment to the cause. I mean, this is not a big production. I mean, you talk about one particular trip where they go across the desert in a series of jeeps, conditions that are just horrific. So if you could maybe kind of touch upon that. And also, one of the things that I found really interesting was she had some other rules about entertaining, about who she would entertain for, and kind of how the crowds were made up. And I think we should probably talk about that too.
Yeah, so when American troops landed in North Africa, of course, what struck Josephine, but struck Jacques Abte and many others who were not American, very powerfully, was that American troops were segregated. You had black units and white units, and they were like, well, what's going on? I mean, land of the free, and here we have, segregation on the basis of race of, people who want to fight, and they all want to fight, and what's this about? And they were shocked. And Josephine said to that first show she did, in Casablanca in North Africa, she said, I will perform to the troops, but they will not be segregated when I'm singing to them. So she had her shows desegregated, and it was not popular. It caused a lot of ructions with some in American high command, but no one was going to gainsay Josephine Baker, because she was this incredible asset. And she said to the troops, she said, look, we do have to fight the battle for equality and civil rights. Of course we do. She said, but there's a much greater evil to fight right now, and it's Nazism. We've just got to be pragmatic about this. We have to defeat this threat first, Nazi Germany, and then once that's done, we can come back to the battle for civil rights. And believe you me, I will be with you all the way. So she even brought the troops on the side of her own kind of DIY, makeshift philosophy. And that was the case in all those shows she performed across North Africa and all across Europe. Audiences were not segregated. She never charged for the shows. And yeah, you're absolutely right. So there's that one time they steal the jeeps from the Americans. It's in I can't. Is it Algiers? I can't remember. Yeah. And the vehicles they're driving are so decrepit because they've begged, borrowed, and stolen them. Because Josephine's funding all of this from the fortune she had built up before the war, because she wouldn't accept any money to do this stuff. So they reach, I think it's Algiers, and their vehicles fall apart. In fact, they fall apart on the way, and they end up hitchhiking across the desert. I mean, it's crazy stuff. Anyway, and so they steal the jeeps from the Americans for the next part of their journey, and they kind of drive them out of the city in the depths of the dark hours to hide from the military police, and they just repainted them in Free French colours. It's really out there stuff, and there are countless times on those tours where, both in the North African desert and in and in the war as it became ever more bloody and horrific in Northwest Europe, where Josephine was risking her life and was under fire, and could have very, very easily ended up dying, of course. And many people said, look, she started doing this before the war, She ended doing it after the war because she was there right after the liberation and then into Germany and then into the concentration camps afterwards. And she ruined her health doing this. Why did she not just after 2 years or 3 years say, I've done enough, get me back to the States? She was absolutely die-hard committed, unyielding in that determination to fight.
I mean, she's...
In fact, when she was performing to the troops, it was somewhere in northwest France. It's the push into Germany, and it's bitterly cold, and she's performing in a ball gown on the stage. And one of her tour managers says, "Look, you've got to go inside. You've got to shelter." And she says, "I am a soldier too. I'm a soldier too," and she expects to be treated just like they were.
So, yeah, it's an incredible story. I want to ask you a question about writing and researching this book and writing, digging in around about anything secret, an espionage story. This story, other espionage stories, is challenging because, first of all, the records may be very skimpy, or there may be a big dog preventing you from getting to where the records are. They're still being kept secret. And spies themselves have been known, I don't want to shock you or anybody in the audience, to make some stuff. I mean, one of the things that makes a good spy is that they're a good fabulist, can spin some tales. So in a story like this, how do you try to parse all that to get to the truth? And is there stuff that you didn't use because you weren't, it sounded good but you weren't sure it was true? Is there stuff you used that you were like, I don't know, how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And with this story, it was I've never come across a story with which it was so challenging. So as much of this story was about being a historian, it was about being a detective. There were so many layers of the truth to unpick. So if I can try and explain what I mean by that. So Josephine herself almost never spoke about her secret war work, and certainly never in any depth. So she went to her grave with her secrets. Now, in French intelligence circles, you are supposed to remain silent about anything you've done in terms of espionage work for at least 3 decades. At least 3 decades. Sadly, Josephine died less than 3 decades after the end of her involvement in the war. And most intelligence agents, as you know, go to their grave never having said anything publicly about what they did. So, for example, Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, who was this standout spy, an absolute, he's this icon amongst British intelligence agents to this day. I can tell you stories which will just blow your mind as to how he's viewed today. He went to his grave never having told publicly anything about that's what normally happens. However, there are kind of added layers of secrecy which were written into the accounts that people have told of this story. So Jacques Habte wrote his and Josephine's story of espionage in the war, not long after the war, in fact, in a book called, sorry, the name escapes me. And in that book, he himself deliberately writes in obfuscations because, one, it's still to this day sensitive in France among communities. France was occupied. Thank God Britain and America weren't. So France was occupied, and brother turned against brother, wife turned against husband, village turned against village, and it's still very, very sensitive. Who was a collaborator? Who was a freedom fighter? Who was on the side of right? Who was on the side of wrong? So for that reason, versions of the truth are told. The second reason that Habte and others in particular with this story layered the truth was because, as I said earlier, a lot of what they did in the war was illegal. It was highly illegal. They were smuggling. It was money laundering. It was cigarette smuggling. They were working with mafias and all of that. They felt they had to do, rightly, in my view, during the war, because they had to use whoever it would take to defeat the Nazis. But as soon as the war was ended, that became something that you would not readily want to admit to. So I'll give you an example of that. So Jacques Habte wrote his book, okay? There's no reference at all to all of that smuggling work in his account, which was written in 1947. Then, in the late 60s, he sat down with Remy, the foremost, Gilbert Renault, the foremost French resistance hero, you could argue, in the war. he sat down with Remy, and Remy wrote Jacques Capet and Josephine Baker's war story. It's just called simply J.A., Jacques Capet's initials. It's based upon the interview with Jacques Capet. And in there, Jacques Capet tells the story of the smuggling rackets and how they used them as an intelligence gathering network. Chapter and verse, he gives it's an amazing story. But he uses a pseudonym. So even then, in 1967, he still didn't feel he could admit himself to being the person who, with Josephine, ran those smuggling rackets and used them as intelligence conduits. And then, you graft onto all of that the kind of intensive secrecy that tends to surround the files of intelligence agencies. You would fear that nothing official had actually been released and come out and seen the light of day. Well, I couldn't have written the book, or certainly not in the form it's written, without the French government being very, very open and releasing a raft of files about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, concerning the actions of some of their intelligence agents during the Second World War. And that included Josephine Baker, Jacques Capet, and Colonel Paul Pelloz, and various other key characters' files. Those were absolute gold dust. And without those, so many things couldn't have been said. So, for example, without those files, it would have been impossible, really, to have established the Dunderdale connection, because it's in there in chapter and verse. But without that, and certainly, from my experience, the British Secret Intelligence Service was not about to release any files, because they never do. So we weren't about to get it from that side. So the fact the French government did that, hurrah, well done, French government, hugely well-spirited of you, because those files were absolutely essential. I mean, crucial, vital. And then, I don't know, books are journeys. Every book is a journey. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You start it, something fires you up, you research it, and it takes you on this journey. And in this journey, I had a series of miraculous lucky breaks, which I can't explain to you how. Serendipity is all I can say. I'll just give you one example. So there's a chap in America, lives in the States. He's a British guy called Paul Biddle, who, out of the blue, sent me it was actually a social media message saying, would you like to see the private family archive of Colonel Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale?
Nah.
Right, now, Colonel Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale was Josephine's spymaster in the war and before the war. He was very closely involved with her. So I was like, but my main thought was, how do you have them? So somehow Paul Biddle, who's a very, very, very extensive collector of this kind of material, had got all of Dunderdale's archive, and that included lots and lots of documentation about Dunderdale's time with the Secret Intelligence Service. So he sent me copies of it all. So from that patchwork, you then have to knit together the story. And you're absolutely right. There are parts of it, which I'm sure are true, which I couldn't write because the source wasn't bona fide. So I'll give you an example. There was a German guy in the war, it's an amazing character, Hans Mussig. And Hans Mussig was he was a Hitler Youth guy before the war, woke up to the fact that the Nazis were not a good idea, stole the money from his local Hitler Youth bank account, eloped to Britain, set himself up in Britain as a banker, got found out, fled to France. And in France, they arrested him, but they recruited him for the French intelligence services. Trying to cut a long story short, Mussig became something of a compatriot to Jacques Capet and Josephine Baker in the early stages of their espionage work in the war. And he was this incredible operator. Now, Mussig is mentioned in one or two of their accounts, but only briefly. Mussig writes his own. Well, he didn't write it. He got an Austrian journalist called Simmel to write his account of his war. He uses a pseudonym, but it's definitely Mussig, without a shadow of a doubt. We know that for a fact. And that book, it's called It Can't Always Be Caviar. It was published in German, Simmel being Austrian. You can get it in English, but it's very, very rare. But I've read it. And that book is extraordinary. There's lots and lots of material in there about what Jacques Capet, Josephine Baker, and Hans Mussig got up to. And this is really extraordinary stuff. You can't write that because Simmel says, I am writing this book. It is a true story, but I can't write it as a true story because the person who stories it has asked me to say it isn't a true story. It's one of those catch-22 situations. And I said, no, you can't use that because you just can't. The amazing thing about, you just can't. It's just not verifiable. And also, what you try and do, you guys would appreciate this. You try and make sure there's more than one source. You try and make sure there are 3 or 4 or 5, and you cross-reference those sources. And where you get a number of individuals from a degree of separation saying the same thing, you're pretty certain about what you're saying. With Mussig's account, you just couldn't do that.
Well, Damien Lewis, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for joining us today. It's too bad you don't care about the story at all, and don't seem to know much about it. No, okay. I'm practicing my own deception there. Agent Josephine, American Beauty, French hero, British spy, or was it French, or was it something else? Anyway, all of the above, and a terrific, amazing story, amazing person, and thank you for. That was, he is such a passionate interviewee. Yes. That it was amazing to see that again and to enjoy the time that we spent with him talking about Josephine Baker.
And it's a really cool topic. In fact, on this trip, I had some of my guests, somehow that topic came up, and I said, you really should watch the show because we had this great author on to talk about the book.
I would have thought all of your guests at this point would be History Happy Hour aficionados.
Well, they were, but this was a specific Josephine Baker conversation. So.
Okay. Next week, Chris, we are back live, and we're going to be talking about General Meade at Gettysburg, and we're going to be talking to Kent Masterson Brown about his book, Meade at Gettysburg, A Study in Command. And he's the founder of Civil War magazine, author of 6 books on the Civil War, and probably knows a lot more about it than either you or I do.
Yeah, that's right. And he's going to have a crack at one of those big questions of history, like why didn't Meade go after Lee at Gettysburg or after Gettysburg?
And why didn't Meade become more famous? Why does he end up being, everybody knows Grant and they know Lee and they know Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet, and Meade is kind of like hardly in there at all.
Yeah, he becomes like the General Simpson of the Civil War. Right?
Okay. I hope we mean the General Simpson from World War II as opposed to Homer Simpson. So I wasn't
no.
Okay.
As I did say general.
Just checking that. Okay. All right, guys. Well, join us next week. In the meantime, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Twitter. Listen to our podcast. Back us on patreon.com. And browse historyhappyhour.com. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your support, and please be safe.
Working so hard to bring that to life.
Yeah, appreciate it, guys. It's been a pleasure.